we go. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, if you are in this side of the world. We're very, very grateful today to have Matthew Carter here with us to share the latest developments on the war in Ukraine and how the Vincentian family has responded to the crisis. Matthew joined Depaul International as CEO in September 2021, and he has over 30 years experience working in the international humanitarian sector. So we're very lucky to have him here today. And Matthew, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rihanna, and it's great to be with you. And I have to say, when I was working within the Caritas family, and when I left working for Caritas, I thought I was coming to a slightly different job. But sadly, events have unfolded in Ukraine, and we've drawn on my international skills to support Ukraine, it's been a really difficult 7 months. And I'll talk more about the programme in a minute. I thought it was also interesting to say the reason I was late, and my apologies for being late, is there's an Catholic sort of steering committee that's hosted within the dicastery for integral development. And we've just started a 2-day meeting actually this afternoon and tomorrow, bringing together Jesuit Refugee Services, ICMC, which is the International Catholic Migration Service, Caritas, and Depaul. So there's a lot happening, which has been really, really useful. And I have to say that the Vatican have been really good about bringing us together and giving us that space where we can share information and work in a really coordinated and effective way. And through which actually the Depaul program, Depaul Ukraine program, has also been fortunate to receive some funding through, so that continues. So I left my colleague Ewan Day Collins, who many of you know, so he's representing us all this afternoon in that meeting. So I'm just going to give you a quick update, talk you through some points, and then there's obviously time for questions and answers. So as many of you know, Depaul Ukraine was established in 2007, and it's important to remember the origins of the organisation. It was various church groups and the Orthodox Church in Ukraine who approached Depaul and Mark McGreevy at that time to ask for help in terms of the vast numbers of street homeless there were and rough sleepers. And that had occurred primarily because of the end of the Soviet period and there not being a welfare system in place. So there were huge numbers of people, either ex-soldiers and a lot of young people and children living in the sewers underground by the sort of heating pipes that heat most of the cities, to try and keep warm through the winter. And that was the sort of start and the origins of the programme. And then when the Crimea annexation happened, and then in the 2014-15 conflict, Depaul Ukraine became more established and started to provide services for those who were displaced through the war. Many of you know that information already. If you didn't, I thought it was an important bit to just plot that history, because it shows what an important part of the family Depaul Ukraine has been and become. And those origins go back. And actually, many of you know Father Vitali, who's the most incredible leader, helped set up Depaul Ukraine in 2007, was the first person to meet Mark McGreevy those many years ago, or not that many years ago, but years ago. So drawing out the real strength of the programme over the last 7+ months has been our engagement with the communities within Ukraine. And what you will have seen at the start of the crisis was, vast numbers of people pouring across borders and into neighbouring countries like Poland and Slovakia and Romania and Macedonia. but the bulk of the population have remained behind. Many of those who fled, they were fleeing from the east, which was they had to leave anyway. But perhaps some of those had slightly more resources at their fingertips, not a lot of resource, but which enabled them to leave the country more quickly, but also enabled them to establish they had established links into parts of Europe. And that's what we've seen, very needy people. But those who remain behind, the bulk of the population, were extremely poor. And the statistics given on Ukraine prior to the war, that a large number of the population lived in poverty, which is similar to parts of the developing world, parts of Asia and parts of Latin America. So it was a tough existence before. And Depaul Ukraine immediately prioritized that they wanted to focus. So I was trying to think back this morning, actually, how the decision actually came about, how would we respond like this? But I think it was because that's what Depaul Ukraine wanted to do. They said, we have to live and work alongside the communities in Ukraine, and we want to be doing something. And it happened, and I think it was a totally unanimous decision by Depaul Ukraine, Depaul International, and yourselves, that we had to respond in some shape or form. And that's what started quite a small program, but has grown into something quite considerable and amazing as well. As many of you know, Depaul Ukraine's head office, or where they were mainly located, was in Kharkiv, which is in the east, which you see is right on the border of the Donbass region, and is constantly being dragged in and out of the frontline conflict. But we've kept that head office there, and that's where we continue to have the bulk of our operations working out of that area. So the main focuses of the program are the Kharkiv region and surrounding areas, some of the very rural areas around Kharkiv that have been cut off during the conflict, and then along the coastal areas, and then up into Kyiv. So a big and wide-ranging program. But the thing that sets, I think, Depaul Ukraine apart is its knowledge of local context and people and communities, which is what's enabled it to do. My years of providing humanitarian assistance around the world, I think the Depaul Ukraine program is quite unique because of that knowledge and trust that they have with the local community. Sorry, the other area I forgot to mention, which is Odessa, which many of you know, which is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, and that's become under heavy bombardment, although it's received less in recent months. So their program has continued to deliver in some of the most vital areas. And a little anecdote: last week I was at a meeting, a UN meeting, and I was talking to a consultant who specializes in listening to affected populations. They run an organization to make sure the voice of people in crisis is being heard, so we can respond more effectively and are more accountable to those people, rather than they're seen as passive recipients of aid. And I said, she said, we've just commissioned this big piece of research in Ukraine about the international response. And I said, has anything been surprising? She said, actually, it's been pretty disappointing that the big international aid agencies haven't been able to deliver there, and making similar mistakes to what they all make, but still doing some good work. And I said, but there must be one good story. She said, yes, there is a remarkable story. She said, I've worked with an organization I've never come across before, who are respected and loved and delivering the most incredible work. I said, who's that? They said, an organization called Depaul Ukraine. Have you heard of them? And I said, well, actually, I'm the chief executive of Depaul International. And she was fascinated by the origins. And she said, they are extraordinary. You go into cities and people just ask, is Depaul here? Can Depaul provide more help? They understand what we're doing. They understand our needs. So it was just, sorry, a slight aside, but it was just a really lovely thing to hear from someone within the UN system, and they had no idea who I was. So, and that's the sort of story of Depaul Ukraine's work over the last 7 months, has grown from strength to strength over that period. 90% of the funds we've raised, 90% of the resources we've raised has gone into those conflict areas. So we've kept the overheads right down. We've kept staffing at a manageable amount, but the bulk of the aid we've provided continues to go into the most affected areas. 2,000 metric tons of aid, which is, I was trying to look at a sort of physical image of what that is. Like 2 cargo ships, big cargo ships of aid is what we've provided over the last 7 months, from food to heating materials to medical assistance. And the food is based on, we don't just provide anything or everything. It's called a food basket system, which we agree with the government, local and national government, and with the aid system, of what are the 8 critical commodities which are needed within this context. And so some of those would be food items, some of them would be sanitary items like soap, for example. And that's provided. Again, what's really nice is one of the other stories that the local community really like the food baskets that Depaul is providing, but primarily because they're Ukrainians providing us and they know exactly what's needed, rather than sort of international packages. So it's gone down really well. Building on that sort of idea of local community, it's the stories Father Vitaly tells is going into areas and cities which have been heavily bombed. Having that access through local communities, they know the people who are most in need, and most in need that particular week, not that they won't be in need the following week. So they'll go into a street or a block of apartment block and say that the residents at number 3 really need help this week. Can you please visit them? Or the residents at number 4 in this particular block don't need help this week. But that sort of local knowledge is really important, and it's also helped bring communities together. We're currently providing something around between 20 and 25,000 meals per day across Ukraine, and those, in the scheme of things, it's relatively small, but in sort of operational terms, that's huge and amazing. And those food baskets are mainly all targeted on the most vulnerable households, so particularly around people who are elderly, and those who are disabled or single parent families, etc. And again, I think that's the image that always stays with me is those opening images of people fleeing Ukraine, but most of those, as we remember, were able-bodied. And I always think of my mother at this stage, because my mother has dementia, and I know that she wouldn't be able to leave, and she is one of those people that Depaul Ukraine would be helping at this time. You know, those people, like in any part of society, are there, but that's where Depaul Ukraine has, you know, stood up to the real challenge of providing assistance. And you will have seen, again, in the weekly updates, you know, the most lovely, uplifting stories of how aid is got through to really difficult areas and parts of the city. We were approached, this was a couple of months ago now, but we were approached by the Uber Eats cyclists for Kharkiv, you know, who prior to the war, it was a normal European city. They would bring hot meals to the door or do your shopping, etc. And they approached us to Depaul and said, could we help deliver food packages, the food baskets, to the front door of the people you're trying to help? And we said, that would be fantastic. And then on Saturday morning, something like 40 cyclists arrived, all in their cycling gear, and have subsequently become a real central sort of pillar of the programme in providing, delivering those packages across a war-torn city. You know, they can get in and out of places quickly. They don't have to go by the main roads, etc. So again, that's been a real effective part of the program. And then we're looking at we've come out of the first 6 months, and we're now planning for the next 12 to 18 months of the program, as things have not stabilized, but as we've learned more and how of what is needed within different contexts. So we're building on the St Vincent model of day centres that's the SVP run, and the daughters run, and Depaul runs, and we still run in many countries of the world, because it's such an effective model, because it provides, as you know, a number of layers of support. It's a space where people can come and talk. It's a space where people can have a hot meal, and then attached to those day centres, we can provide people who can provide psychological support for people who are seriously traumatized. We can provide help in terms of if people need rehousing or moving to different bits of the city. We can link up government officials to provide support and advice to people who've become displaced. So it's become a bit like a sort of one-stop shop where people can come for a variety of support needs, medical advice, etc., etc. And like we run, whether Depaul runs in the US or Croatia or London or Dublin, it's that sort of model that we've all helped develop, and it works incredibly successfully because it gives a sense of community at the heart of it, with other components bolted around it. And that's what we'd like to replicate over some of the cities. So that's one part of a very big and complex program. And we'll continue to provide services and adapt services as we move forward. The extraordinary scale to which the program has grown has been truly astonishing. Prior to the war, we provided homeless services. We provided a level of support to people who've been displaced, as I said, by the former war. And we also had quite a unique program in working with the prison service across Ukraine. And that was primarily of people who were coming out of prison and how they were going to be housed, etc. That very much continues. I mean, it's starting to say that the prisons have had to continue, and people are coming out of having finished their time, and Depaul continues to work in that area, as well as its humanitarian program. So it's adapting as we move forward. But the program prior to the war, the cost per year was around approximately £500,000 per year, of which the majority of the funding came from ourselves. And now that's increased considerably to a budget of over £1 million a month. So it shows the sheer scale of what's being achieved with Father Vitali's leadership, his board of trustees, the staff that's grown, not disproportionately. I think they've got about 80 staff now across the country, and then a technical support team from Depaul International. And then also Depaul, Slovakia has become our logistics hub, which is where we do all our purchasing from, and the bulk of aid is shipped across the border and then brought down through various routes into Ukraine. And that's, we've had a number of tried and tested ways of moving aid around. In the early days of the war, we used trains, but that was incredibly slow. And I remember we had a huge shipment of about 30 metric tons of medical aid from St John's Ambulance, and we had to ship that down from the Slovakian border to Kharkiv, which was really difficult. And typically Father Vitali said, this is such a big shipment, I will personally have to sit on the train with it. And the train trip took nearly 3 days because they were constantly coming not directly under fire, but in really difficult times when there was aerial bombardment. But Father Vitali, in his normal wonder, sent me a picture on my birthday. He said, "I haven't forgotten your birthday, Matthew," and he was saying mass on the train as he sat on his own heading towards Kharkiv over that long 3-day trip. He's the most remarkable individual, and I'll be with him for a few days next week, which will be great. So looking ahead just quickly, and then I'll open this up for questions. The big fear at the moment, well, not fear, but the reality is the winter coming. Very harsh weather conditions. It can, as we know, can drop to -20. But this year, there's electricity supplies is sporadic. The centralized heating system that most of Ukraine's cities survive off is severely damaged in many places. So there's a lot of unknowns. The UN estimate 1.5 million people will be in dire need or extreme need over the winter period of not having sufficient access to keep to somewhere to keep warm through the winter period. So it's something we're already working on stockpiling of food, bringing in additional warm clothing, blankets, and looking at also stockpiling of fuel, and looking with the UN of providing some form of heating or centralized heating systems. So a lot to worry about. Also, the numbers that continue to be affected by the war continue. The war isn't abating, sadly. With the gains that the Ukrainian army have made in recent weeks, that's great news, but it's that's released about 150,000 people who have now got no homes, and they've moved towards Kharkiv. So we're having to rehouse those, or work with the government to rehouse those, or find temporary sheltering homes. So the needs continue in a really bleak and tragic situation. And then people often say to me, "How long will this continue?" We don't know. I've spent much of my life working in these sort of places, and there sadly seems no end in sight. And it's such a ridiculous conflict. It shouldn't have happened. It's what's the motivation behind it, and what's the end goal, really? It's just creating such misery in a country that was coming out of that history of misery and finding its feet. But we can only continue to hope and pray that change will happen soon, and I think we all remain hopeful. And that's why, when realistically people say, "How do you deal with this, Matthew?" or "How does the team deal with it?" Yes, it's tough, and you get down. And then Vitaly will call me, Father Vitaly will call me in the evening and saying, "Matthew, I'm on my way to Kharkiv again. How are you? How's your family?" Always thinking about the other. And you realize that, that buoys you up, and off you go again. So I think that's the same for all the team and for all our supporters. Just remarkable. And we continue to be able to support and deliver a remarkable program. Anyway, that's a quick snapshot, and I thought it was much better than doing a PowerPoint that I just talked to where we were. We're part of a family. That's the great thing about working within Ukraine. We're all one single family. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Does anyone have any questions at all? Feel free to raise your hand, or virtually raise your hand too. I'm sure we may get some, but people think, yeah, Matthew, extremely grateful for you sharing that with us today. There's obviously some shocking and incredibly sad information there, but I think, yeah, you certainly showed how important leadership is, and working together, and hope during crisis. There are some huge numbers there in terms of the amount of aid that Depaul has been providing, and yeah, one thing that really stuck with me is the importance of listening as well to the people that we're supporting in order to respond appropriately. I think listening, yeah, is extremely important. Thank you ever so much. Does anybody have a question at all? You've covered everything. We've got Sister Maureen.
I'm just thinking, now there's that kind of bogus referendum happening in parts of Ukraine, and the conscription of young Russian men. How do you think that's going to play out? Have you any sense of how that will play out in the coming weeks?
I've no idea. I mean, I think that the conscription thing is just, I think we all hope, I suppose, that there will be a process where the population of Russia will be able to sort of bring about a halt to this ridiculous conflict. But we're also seeing the brutality of the government there. So it's pretty bleak. But then this is a country of however many million. If more rise up, they won't be able to put them all in prison. So I just hope, I think we all hope one day we'll turn on the news and there will be a sense of change, and that some goodness will seep its way in and bring an end to this. You know, I found those comments a few weeks ago from Putin about when Queen Elizabeth died, of actually, I thought perhaps he is reaching out, because there were such heartwarming words about when he'd met the Queen. So it was quite bizarre, I think, for all of us. So there was a sort of hope that that might bring about change. I think we just have to continue to hope and pray that, and really pray that this will come to an end, because it can't. I can't see an end in sight. And in terms of your question, more in around the local areas in and around Kharkiv, with these sort of mock shams of elections, you know, we're hearing directly from the people we support that, you know, it is a sham. It's, you know, it's not a fair election at all. So sorry, not really an answer, but.
Sister Ellen, did you have a question? Did I see you raise your hand?
It's more of an observation than a question. Hello, Matthew. We haven't met yet, but hopefully we will. I was just thinking about the newsletters that you mentioned and how great they've been for keeping us all informed. And I wanted to say thank you to whoever is generating them, because they have really impressed us and kept us going and kept us on the inside track as a family. I think one of the advantages of being a wider family is that there is a huge amount of support for everything that you're doing. And I, for one, am kind of very proud of Depaul Ukraine, having been there with Vitaly at the beginning with Mark. I just think when the war began, I kind of knew confidently that Depaul Ukraine would respond robustly, but I think they've surpassed my wildest expectations, and I can only be grateful that they're there. And I loved what you said about the UN person, you know, telling you they'd come across this organization they'd never heard of. So I think as a family, and of course we've a lot of daughters on the ground, some in Ukraine, but a lot in Slovakia, and 3 provinces in Poland. You know, it's the drawing in of everything that we've got that I think is the strength of the Vincentian family. And, you know, when we first arrived in Kharkiv, the AIC were already there with the daughters. And I think it's just a marvelous kind of sense. I know that the tragedy is terrible, but it's a marvelous sense of response that sort of jointly we've given birth to. And I just want to express my appreciation. And thank you for being there at this point, Matthew, with all of your background and experience, which I've read on the website. You know, it's you know, and it's great. So thank you, just thank you. And we will continue to pray, and we will continue to read and support you in whatever way we can.
Thank you. Last week I was I did part 1 of my values training, which I wasn't able to do the second bit, but which I adored. So I was in Paris with Sister Maria.
Yeah.
And I just went round and I just felt everything that was being said. It was like St. Vincent was speaking to us that day. You know, it would have been exactly what he would have done, and Louise de Marillac as well. And I just thought it was incredibly uplifting, actually. So I think I went off with thinking, oh, what's this values training about? But it was exactly what I needed, actually.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Matthew.
It's so helpful, and it just buoyed us all up. Yeah. So thank you.
Dee?
Good afternoon, Matthew. I'm an AIC member, and it's interesting. We were recently in Paris with Sister Maria as well, actually, our parish. But one of the things you probably have picked up on that's big in Vincentian Carers is providence. And I think actually it's very providential that although you say you thought you were leaving Caritas for another world, I think your experience gained there is hugely important right now. And I feel it is very, very providential that you're with us. On the AIC front, particularly relating to Kharkiv, the good news is that exactly what Sister Ellen referred to, our Vincentian Family Network, was hard at work. And although her own apartment was bombed, Anna Skoriek, who is the local director, and Father Jan Martinček, who is a Vincentian there, they were able to get exactly what you referred to, the disabled onto trains and through networks, through the various AIC members, into care in Germany. And so that was thousands of miles across Europe. So it's very, very heartening that there's lots of side stories, but for each one of those people is crucial and really important. So thank you again for coordinating everything.
No, that's quite okay. I'm a small part of it all, but it's the individuals you always meet along the way that buoy you up. And again, people say, is there anything I can do? If like Dee, you have those contacts you have, they're the most important things. The part of Italia was just to me, if people have my number, just text me. I love to hear from everybody. But those things are so important, those contacts you all have, to keep those messages coming through. They might not have time to always respond, but it allows, I think it gives that great strength of us being one human family and working together.
Thank you. Do we have any last questions at all before we wrap up? No. Well, yeah, on behalf of all of us, Matthew, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your time, and certainly inspired us for the rest of the day and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And very, very happy to join you whenever. So just give me a shout.
Thank you,
Oh,
Matthew.
that's great.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.